Hello everyone. This is my PowerPoint slash YouTube hybrid video about my personal ethics. It's going to include a little bit about Aristotle, utilitarianism, and how it relates to my nursing. I want to start off by talking about Aristotle's ethics, which kind of shapes a lot of my worldview. And for a lot of people and a lot of philosophers, it does as well, because he kind of set the groundwork for the transition from let's just talk about what is ethical to how do we live ethically. It started off with the Nicomachean Ethics. It's called that because he wrote to a man named Nicomacheus, and so those little letters are named after him. It's the largest, most popular work by Aristotle on ethics specifically, and helps define his larger works, known as the Aristotelian Ethics. What those letters really set out for was to say, how do we find perfect happiness within our activity? And you'll hear it called eudaimonia a lot of times. It just means happiness. And it's an excellency in any activity in accordance with the nature of that activity. So it's obviously very flexible, but it's trying to find the best path to the most happiness. The virtues that Aristotle was concerned with include intellectual virtues and moral virtues, among others, but those are two of the main chapters of his Nicomachean Ethics. Intellectual virtues are things like wisdom, understanding, prudence, and it's taught to us through instruction, just like we're doing now. We're all in school, we're all trying to increase our intellectual virtues. Moral virtues are things like prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. These are more the result of habit. You can be taught these things. We can hear, hey, you should be a good person, but it doesn't work unless we actually complete it and it becomes a part of who we are. And he says that there, it's not natural or inborn, but it's acquired through practice. And eventually they start to flourish within us. Aristotle was a big fan of what's called the mean, the middle path, the golden mean. And basically what that is that there are ways that we should act in order to be happy, to have eudaimonia. But it's very easy to go too far in both directions. Examples are as such, for courage. If you are deficient in courage, you have cowardice. And if you are in excessive courage, you have foolhardiness. And there's some other ones on there. Another one that I really like is the whole idea of modesty. If you're too modest, you have shamelessness. If you're not modest enough, you have shamelessness. And if you're too modest, you have bashfulness. And that applies to all things. So we have to try and find the middle path. Other people that have expounded upon this in distinct geographical regions at different times. Prior to Aristotle, two people back, so Plato taught Aristotle, Socrates taught Plato. Socrates said men must know how to choose the mean and avoid extremes. Zhong Yang is the doctrine of the mean. It's one of the 4 chapters in the Confucian Analects, so it takes up a rather large part of it. It represents moderation, sincerity, honesty, and objectivity. And finally, this mouthful down here, the Madhyama Mata Pratapad, is the middle way, a Buddhist term for attempting moderation in all things. This was originally attributed to Siddhartha Gautama, the historical Buddha, and it's permutated throughout all different types of Buddhism, Mahayana and Hinayana and all those, but it basically means follow the middle path. So how do these virtues go inside the community? According to Aristotle, you have to live within the community. You can't live a cloistered, a secluded life. You have to share in your virtues, and that way you can practice them, and it reinforces the virtues that you cultivate. Some of the strengths of the stuff I just talked about, the eudaimonia, the strength of virtue ethics, is that it relies on the importance of the person, motive, heart, and conscience. It connects you to the community. As nurses, obviously, we live within the community and work within the community. It also is really cool in that it's flexible, that morality is not defined by moments, but it's a long-term process. In other words, in this moment, you may be stressed out and you're not really experiencing eudaimonia, but it's over the course of your entire life that you have eudaimonia, that happiness. It also allows for gray areas, which I think is really important. We're all at a point in our lives where we know that the world is not yes or no. When our parents tell us, this is bad, there's always an exception to that rule. Any introspection into your own philosophy, I'm sure you can find an exception to just about everything you think of. And so it's important that it allows for that. Some of the weaknesses that I've noticed of virtue ethics is that it depends on strong community. So if you are a little isolated, it doesn't really flourish. It's not always easily applied because it is flexible. So you could almost always make an argument for, the way you're acting is a deficient vice, or the way you're acting is an excessive vice. My way is the middle path. So how do you define the middle path, and how do you define eudaimonia? It can also become denigrate into a duty-based ethics. That's that deontology that we saw earlier this week in something Bonnie posted online in the discussion board, and it's really not about duty at all. Because of that, it can be difficult to once again define how to live a virtuous life per Aristotle's model. And then finally, eudaimonia can be luck-based. In other words, Aristotle talks about, and I believe it's in the Nicomachean Ethics, he talks about how if your child was born disfigured and unappealing, that he would have a hard time being eudaimonious because the world wouldn't easily accept him. So him operating within the community would be difficult, and finding a eudaimonious lifestyle would be hard just based on the luck of how you're born. I think that makes it probably its largest drawback. I also tend to incorporate utilitarianism into everything I do. I'll readily admit that might just be an issue of laziness or ignorance, that it can be very self-serving sometimes, and I'll get into that a little bit later. But utilitarianism is really cool. It's all about consequentialism. What's the outcome of what you do? It's not just about what did you attempt to do, what actually happened. And that really dictates how you act in the future. And utilitarianism is subdivided endlessly, just as every type of philosophy is, sort of ad nauseum. And I don't know if I've necessarily picked a certain type. If I, preference utilitarianism, two-level utilitarianism, negative utilitarianism, it's all the same in that I'm not willing to go down that rabbit hole too far. It's just about the most amount of good for the most amount of people in that moment. Some of the strengths of utilitarianism: if used properly, it's the best outcome for most amount of people. Pretty much what I just said. You're looking to increase the happiness and the virtue of all people around you. It can often be common sense based. A lot of times we kind of know and readily act in a utilitarian way. Things like sharing with people, those kind of things. Instead of keeping the whole bag of candy to yourself, you share them among your friends. That's utilitarianism. You may be happy with 20 candies, but everyone will be a little more happy if you split it amongst them. So just common sense, really. Some of the weaknesses: it doesn't account for personal preferences, selfishness. It's a lot like communism in that sense, where it works if everyone's doing it, but if someone's acting selfish, and the whole system can get defunct and is unbalanced. If there's 20 people once again, and 19 are acting like utilitarianistic in that they're trying for the most good, and one person just keeps taking and taking, the system can easily fall apart. And probably the biggest weakness of utilitarianism is it's impossible to properly predict outcomes. Because it doesn't matter about intent in utilitarianism, it's only about outcome. You can try and do what you think is best for your patient, but when it turns out wrong, you've self-defeated yourself with utilitarianism, because you thought that it was best to perform chest compressions and you broke their ribs, and then they later died from a pneumothorax or something. But it was impossible for you to know that at that time. So utilitarianism can be self-defeating. And then again, how do you best determine utility? When you're working with a patient, we've all had those people where there's not really a good option. What do we do first? And it's impossible to have the time freeze to be able to fully assess what's going on in a perfect world and decide how best to act and to know that outcome ahead of time. Okay, so how does all my philosophical ramblings connect to my healthcare itself? Well, it really just all that, the Aristotle virtue ethics and the normative ethics of utilitarianism set the groundwork for how I view the world. If we look at Aristotelian virtue ethics, it assumes everyone, including the patient, wants to live in eudaimonia. How should I best act in the middle path, golden mean, to be virtuous unto the patient? So it adds a certain level of empathy, but from a philosophical standpoint. And utilitarianism forces you to have empathy as well and look at best outcome. My example would be an organ transplant. Should the kidney go to the 80-year-old or the 16-year-old? Utilitarianism would generally say the 16-year-old would have the better chance at living a full life, and so we should give it to them. And that's often how I frame things. And then finally, just to go back to where I said sometimes I can use utilitarianism to selfish ends, and you need to be careful there. The example I always use, and I'm sorry, it's not healthcare related, but if I'm out walking my dog and I have bags with me, I remember I brought them and he poops, I'll gladly pick it up. But if I'm 3 miles from the house and there's no one around and I don't have a bag on me, I'm probably not going to go run home the 3 miles, find a bag, come back and pick it up, because I feel like the best utility there is only at this point considering me, in that I don't want to have to do an extra 3 mile loop back and forth, and it's not really directly affecting anyone at that time. Obviously, that can sound very selfish. So I feel like the Aristotelian ethics of the virtue and how to live a good life help balance out the sort of the greed that can come along with utilitarianism if you're not careful. And so, does all this philosophy connect to nursing ethics? It absolutely does. I took a couple of the parts from the ANA ethics to give you guys an idea of what's going on. If you look at autonomy, the right to pursue happiness, regardless of whether or not you're a patient. However, being a patient means you're vulnerable to loss of autonomy, and it should be more closely guarded. So it really makes me look at them again with empathy and protect their autonomy. If you look at beneficence, compassion, and desire to do good is the entire purpose of Aristotelian ethics. Once again, those ethics frame my worldview. And if you also look at fidelity, it's part of the middle path. It's about virtuous living and being having justice and being honest. And then finally, the only really big exception I can see to my worldview of philosophy and ethics is that I don't agree with moral or ethical relativism. I agree it does in fact exist, but some things cannot be considered ethical despite the situation. Maleficence, which is another term for harm, is a prime example. I don't think there's ever a reason to harm a patient regardless of the situation, and I'm open to debate on that if someone has a reason as to why. But if you can't come up with a reason, then I would posit that you also don't agree with ethical relativism, that there are indeed some things that cannot be argued for despite the situation or the culture. And finally, last thoughts. Other people in philosophy that has helped shape my worldview and how I approach healthcare would be Thomas Merton, Chuang-Tzu, Ken Wilber, Sam Harris, Mohandas Gandhi, who actually, his autobiography speaks repeatedly about nursing, surprisingly. I never knew he was a nurse until I read his book, and he wasn't a nurse in the traditional sense of he went to nursing school, but in several of the wars and down in South Africa, he acted as a nurse for sick people often, and he said that it really shaped his worldview to care for people, and so he actually helped push me into nursing, reading his book. And also Thich Nhat Hanh, and which I probably butchered the spelling there, and also Alan Watts. Thank you for your time, everyone, and have a great day. Take care.